Hello, good afternoon. I'm immensely pleased to announce our speaker for today. This is Professor Alexis Shotwell, professor in sociology and anthropology at Carleton University in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. Where do I start? Alexis is a feminist philosopher who is interested in the complicity and complexity of our livelihoods. She's investigated the history of AIDS activism, and she is, and this is her function today, a literary scholar as well. But I should also add that Alexis is also a bicycle mechanic and has a strong interest in pottery. As for the publications, I think the book that deserves to be mentioned first is Against Purity, Living Ethically in Compromised Times, from 2016, in which she, a book that really established Alexis as one of the most interesting figures in contemporary philosophy. The book is written in a, I think, very approachable, personal, intimate style that challenges common assumptions of identity, and she discusses the relationship between the individual and the collective in a highly original way. I highly recommend the book. The previous book is Knowing Otherwise, Race, Gender, and Implicit Understanding, a book on the different forms of understanding beyond propositional reasoning. So it's you have a strong focus on conceptual breakdowns and racial formation. An article, a recent article that I also highly recommend is Flourishing is Mutual, Relational Ontologies, Mutual Aid, and Eating, from 2021. It's a great take on the complex role of that food has adopted in contemporary society, and here she challenges established ideas and cliches about the role that food contributes in our identity formation, etc. I could also now go on about your activism, etc., but since we're in such a scholarly setting, I leave it here. I should also mention that Alexis has put the today's lecture on her website. This is alexisshotwell.com, alexisshotwell.com. So the text to today's lecture is online. So if you would like to follow it, browsing on your phone, then this is an option. So the floor, thank you very much for coming here.
Thank you, Johannes, and thank you for hosting. Thank you for having me here at the Institute. I feel really honored and delighted to be here. And it's such a treat for me to get to share some of this work. This is work from a book that I've been writing on the side as sort of a secret rebellion to the book that I was supposed to be writing. And just over the summer, I finally jettisoned completely my dutiful secret rebellion book. And so this is all I'm doing. I'm really having a good time with it, but also it's very in process. And so I am especially grateful to get to share this with this particular audience, because there are various things that I'm doing that I'm not sure if it's the right way. And I think you might be able to sort of poke me and suggest different paths and, just give actually really, I'm really excited for the feedback. The book as a whole right now is about the question of how we as humans confront and work with wicked problems. So problems that are complicated, where there is no easy solution, where any solution we aim to address something to make something better makes other things worse, so that the ethical and political stakes of trying to solve complicated things like climate change, forced migration, war, they're not solvable by individual ethical orientations. One of the theoretical touchstones that I've been finding for thinking about that relationship between the individual and a collectivity that is necessary to actually address wicked problems has been Ursula Le Guin, a science fiction writer. So what I'm going to share with you is a section of the first chapter where I'm sort of setting up some of the question of what it looks like to have a long process of changing the world for the better collectively. And then thinking with what I'm characterizing as Le Guin's existentialist anarchism. So there's a lot of pieces here that I think are, I feel compelled by. I think I'm right about them, but I might be wrong. So we'll just see. And I can tell you, if you're interested in the discussion, more about sort of the other chapters and where this is going. I'm going to read, and I don't have any PowerPoint at all. And I apologize for, I'm traveling so much that I'm being very COVID cautious, both to have a little bit of a stuffy nose, and I don't want to give anything to anyone. So I'm wearing the mask, which I know can be more difficult for understanding. So I'll try to speak at a good pitch and speed, but please, if I'm going too fast or mumbling, just raise your hand and tell me to slow down. And folks online, you're welcome to chat something if I'm going too fast or you miss something. Does anyone online need a different volume? Is the microphone okay in where it's placed? If I can get one or two people giving me a reaction of any kind. Yes, thank you, Simona. Yes, awesome. Yes. Okay, perfect. Thank you all. Okay. Louder, yes. Okay. Atmospheric chemist Susan Solomon made the world better. Is that okay? In 1986, she established that human use of chlorofluorocarbons was affecting the ozone layer and helped inaugurate a decisive shift away from them. The Montreal Protocol for stopping the use of chemicals that deplete the ozone layer was opened for nations to sign the following year, 1987. It took until 2009 for all member nations of the United Nations, a very specific group, obviously, to sign on to the protocol. The very good news is that likely by 2070, the hole we created in the ozone layer will be completely healed. This is a story of collectively shifting from a world-destroying practice to a world-healing one. There are many stories like this, of people doing hard work over a long time to change the world. Solomon's work on CFCs was vital, but she did not begin the turn away from using them. She built on the work of Mario Molina, who first formulated the theory that Solomon proved. When Molina's work was recognized by a Nobel Prize in 1996, it was in concert with his advisor, Sherwood Rowland, along with scientist Paul Crutzen. Science is collective, iterative, and densely interdependent. Learning about the history of CFCs is wonderful, in part because it offers us snapshots of the lifelong work of chipping away at something and making a change. It offers a glimpse of how complicated, dull, and persistent that work sometimes must be, and how dedicated. Volume okay? Think about the quiet conclusion of another long-term process that makes the world better, safely disposing of the United States' vast stockpile of chemical munitions. I often cry when I reflect on this, and I like to say this when I'm giving lectures because it is socially weird to cry when you're giving a scholarly lecture. I think I will make it through this next paragraph, but just in case, don't worry. I cry a lot. Everything's okay. And I think I cry because it's moving to think about the long work against war. And also because the mind boggles at how much more work there is to do toward anything we might call peace. There are scientists, activists, and ordinary workers who have spent their lives on the project to disarm chemical weapons in the US. I don't know if they think back to the movements against using chemical agents in the wake of World War I, or further back still to 2 Hague conventions against using, quote, asphyxiating or deleterious gases, or before that, much longer ago, to agreements to not use poisoned bullets in war. One of the activists who worked toward the disarmament of chemical weapons in the US is Craig Williams, a Vietnam veteran who worked with US Senator Mitch McConnell in his earlier and perhaps less conservative days. Mitch McConnell is sort of one of the, he's like a little demon in the US government. He's just a terrible man. It's shocking that he did any helpful work on this chemical weapons thing. Just for context, it's very weird. They worked together to uncover and address the problems with plans to dispose of chemical weapons in conventional incinerators. So the plan was just to burn all this sarin gas, mustard gas, or there was another plan to just dump it in the ocean. Lots of bad plans. There's no easy part of the story of chemical munitions, including the triumphant but quiet conclusion in July 2023 of the long process of destroying this stockpile in the US. The ghosts of everyone targeted or affected by chlorine, mustard, or sarin gas surely stand with those killed by bullets, landmines, and radiation. I don't know about you, but my mind moves quickly from a measured and definitive win, such as the destruction of the final of nearly 1 million mustard shells in Pueblo, New Mexico this last summer, to the vast array of other fights we have yet to win, from global warming to child enslavement in cobalt mines. And today, of course, I'm thinking a lot about what's happening in Israel and Palestine in the terms of escalation of incredible suffering. This example of CFCs and healing the ozone layer helps me remember the endless chain of scientific work required to win contingent but real victories. The example of destroying chemical munitions stockpiles helps me remember the enormous work yet to be done. Both examples illustrate something Bill Moyers characterizes as a difficulty activists often have. We struggle to name and claim victories. Using the example of work against nuclear proliferation, Moyers discusses several ways we might lose track of what has been done and what has been won, and by whom. So Moyers gives these examples of people who did long-term work to try to reduce reliance on nuclear energy in concert with people who were doing work against nuclear weapons production. And he does these gives these lovely examples, case studies of where it took such a long time that sometimes the people who had initiated the fights had died or gotten dispirited and stopped. Or often what would happen is that the work that they were doing would become so normalized that then sort of centrist politicians would take it up and claim that it was their idea. So there's like all of these ways that work that people do, activist work, becomes something that they have a hard time claiming the victory of, either because they sort of forget, or it's a partial victory, or it gets appropriated by politicians and people in power. So that's interesting, right? Looking at like, when you make a win, how do you know that you've won something and how do you remember it? So that's just a product of history. And I think that wherever else we are in history, we're in the middle of a muddle, an endlessly complex situation beyond our personal control. That's kind of the definition of being in the middle of multiple wicked problems. But we can clearly and definitively know when things are wrong, have ideas about how they might be better, and we can set off to work with others to change the world. We can begin anew with the understanding that there is no way to erase the difficult path that has brought us to the need for fundamental transformations. So here, I'm going to argue that it's especially useful to attend to process, or the way we do things, when we're aiming to begin anew under conditions of systemic oppression and wrongdoing. We confront multiple existential crises at a planetary scale, wicked problems where every solution we enact produces other problems, and where none of us are innocent of implications in harm. In this context, the path toward injustice may seem overdetermined and inevitable. Wicked problems are complicated. They are usually things we need a complex and collective effort to address, and so they are problems that invite working in coalition, that most difficult and annoying form of organizing. There are so many overlapping and mutually constituting forces that predict the future being more of the same, that it is sometimes hard to tell where impulses to liberatory transformation come from. Being embedded in the middle of what feels like a hopeless tangle can overload our ability to think about what can be done to help ease suffering. And times of crisis intensify tendencies to not think expansively, slowly, carefully, or with any kind of curiosity and play. Changing direction, setting off in a new path, starting something that will later be described as a beginning, these things are difficult to self-generate, especially in confronting wicked problems such as global heating. Happily, we don't need to self-generate anything. Indeed, I think perhaps the only way we create anything is through relations with others. Generation is collaboration. At the same time, I'm interested in what forms of responsibility and personal initiative we might be called to take up, and the ways that it is precisely our unique specificity that we can offer to the good of the world. I'm interested in, and the sort of broader book project is about these questions of where the possibility for changing the world come from, what it requires of us, and what we can offer. So I'm trying to bring the philosophical conversation we call existentialism into the same room as practical conversations variously understood as anarchism, asking, how might collectivity, communism, and community be important to any attempt to address wickedly complex, iterative problems? Most of the work that I'm familiar with that is bringing anarchism and existentialism into dialogue has focused on the putative individual exercising their personal freedom. I think this approach unnecessarily narrows the scope of freedom these traditions open for us. Both existentialism and anarchism have been read as though they are in conflict with communism, or perhaps orthodox Marxism. And we could talk about some of the reasons historically why that happened. But I'm going to argue that instead, the collectivity of freedom is necessary and generative to any serious anarchist or existentialist project. So for me, and I was saying to Johannes on the train, it's a little bit embarrassing to me to be 48 and going back and reading these texts that I was very captivated by when I was 19. So maybe this is like the sort of social theorists' version of buying a little red sports car, and it's like a midlife crisis to return to existentialism. If you're getting that vibe, I would be happy if you would tell me. So see what you think as you hear this. I think, though, for me now, the main usefulness of an existential approach to wicked problems has been what it offers to the project of carrying on, even though it seems hopeless and absurd to carry on. I think that perhaps this possibility in existentialism comes most directly out of the tradition's reckoning with oppression, including work in response to the Holocaust, gender oppression, colonialism, and racial oppression. And one of the things that I've been recovering that I didn't read when I was 19 is work from Black existentialists who were really thinking about racial oppression in similar ways to how Fanon, for example, is thinking about colonialism, or how Beauvoir thinks about gender. So I now see race as central to the existentialist project in a way that I was never taught when I was a university student. Generally, and probably everyone in the room is familiar with this, existentialism has begun with the recognition that humans, given freedom and choice, have chosen to commit atrocities or to stand by and ignore horrific things being done in our name. How do we go on when we look unflinchingly at that fact? Atrocities and evils continue. They limit the basic conditions of our lives. Part of what we are flung into is the inheritances of these evils, and differentially, depending on how we're situated, being the beneficiaries of ongoing atrocities. Existentialism helps me think about this and about the idea that I and we can still practice freedom in this context. Anarchism helps me think about how to decide what freedom could mean. So novelist and theorist Ursula Le Guin is my primary touchstone for thinking through these issues, though what I'm going to offer here is by no means either a hagiographic or an encyclopedic engagement with her thinking. Methodologically, I'm reading across existentialism, anarchism, and fiction with this particular interest in speculative fiction. Taking Le Guin as a core theorist of all three genres is perhaps a heterodox move. I am reading her fiction as theory. This is one of the things that I especially would love this group to tell me if I'm not allowed to do. Sometimes I think of the approach I take to her work as though I'm reconstructing a primary text from an auto-commentary on the text, tracing and articulating core ideas through examining their application. If I were reading nonfiction, I would say that I'm reconstructing lost works through fragments and aphorism quoted in an extant work. In science fiction and fan fiction, there are cases in which people later write the works that they referenced in the fictional space. So that I have a bunch of examples of places where people have done this. They've written a science fiction book that references a canonical text, and then they write the canonical text. In this case, there's no specific source text. Like Le Guin didn't write the actual text that she references through her work. But I do think there is a reasonably unified set of core commitments and approaches manifest in their fictional portrayal. I see Le Guin imagining new forms of relationships through science fiction, offering a kind of hermeneutic generosity to the project of imagining otherwise. Reading her aphorisms, traces of political texts mentioned or quoted in her fictional worlds, and thinking across her fiction illuminates a set of core precepts in her thinking, or at any rate, enough of one that I feel able to put it in conversation with other writers thinking about both existentialism and anarchism. Many of us take it as a given that the social world we've collectively shaped calls out for transformation. Or we look to history and think it is obvious that people of the past have grappled with seemingly insoluble problems or world-destroying tendencies, that things that are just the way things are, and found ways to change them. But actually, it is an achievement to notice that things do not have to be this way, that they have changed, or that we can change the future through our activity in the present. Particularly when collective struggle has won something, it can be difficult to claim and remember that victory, either because there is still so much to do, or because, as Moyers points out, our victories are co-opted by the moderates who initially opposed us. The work of imagining the need for a new beginning, or marking the work of transformation of the past, is interpretive. It requires hermeneutic work and care. Hermeneutics is fundamentally collective and therefore political. Making meaning out of a sequence of events and actions is vital work for nurturing our collective capacity for transformation. From this point of view, personal and collective transformation requires the co-creation of hermeneutic justice. Projects of collective liberation in times of overlapping crises benefit from people having generative interpretive others who help us individuate our felt and epistemic resources. Equally, they benefit from resisting the impulse toward extractivism that animates so much of our social practice now, from resource extractivism to epistemic extractivism, which I'm happy to talk about more, how to resist epistemic extractivism in the academy in particular. Crafting meaning, I think, is a key part of sustaining practices that take each conclusion as simply a new beginning in an ongoing process. This approach helps us to resist the understandable despair and immobilization of reckoning with global existential crises. It helps us to begin again and again after that. We're all of us embedded in a complicated situation that we did not choose. We're born into the middle of overlapping, ongoing processes, which means that beginning any new direction necessarily starts from conditions beyond our control. Donna Haraway formulated a conception of situated knowledge, resisting what she identified as the epistemic God trick that imagines it's possible to stand outside of things in our knowing. Similarly, we might say that our reasoning and action about wicked problems invites us to start our collective deliberation from the middle of time, of relationships, of practices in setting collective goals. And that collectivity includes the world, not just other human reasoners. We're embedded in flows of ongoingness that are beyond our control, and we're determining our means and our ends from there. Some of this beyond our control ongoingness is social. Some of it is physical and biological. Some of it is world historical. Existentialist philosophers call all of this, the things we cannot choose that shape the basic conditions of our lives, our facticity. And I'm sorry if I'm reiterating things about existentialism that are so basic, but I find it actually helpful to just remind us. On that view, we cannot help but begin from within and in relation to all the concrete things that ground our lives, ranging from gravity to our creaturely requirements to eat and drink. It is in conversation with our facticity that we exercise our capacity for freedom, sometimes called our transcendence. In conversation with gravity, we dance, perform kickflips on skateboards, lift weights. In conversation with our need for sustenance, we make delicious foods and enjoy cocktails. In conversation with the inevitability of death, we live and create meaning. My parents, for most of my life, ran a used bookstore and cafe, and they had this motto for the store that still is printed on all of the coffee bags and in a stained glass. And the motto was the senseless pursuit of excellence. So especially when I was a philosophy undergrad, I really thought of this in terms of like Aristotle and Socrates and the idea that we ought to pursue excellence and become our best selves. But lately, I think as I sort of have a lot of despair about the world and where it's going and thinking with an existentialist lens, I'm a little bit more interested in the senseless part. The project of living and creating meaning from an existentialist approach is by definition unpredicted by the current situation in which we find ourselves, our facticity. So there is some way that we could define our capacity for freedom as that which is not predicted by what's given to us. Sartre famously illustrates this with the example of the difference between a pair of scissors and a human being. The scissors are made, they're created to do a particular thing, cut things. Their form expresses their purpose, and their purpose is given to them by their creators. What they are for, their essence, precedes and produces their existence. Scissors are made to be the means for our ends. We create them in order to cut things. They are not free to determine their own ends. In contrast, the claim is that humans have no purpose built into our being. There is nothing in particular we are put on this earth to do. As the phrase goes, our existence precedes our essence. We are made up of means, of ways of doing things, of setting our own ends, of creating ourself. There is no preset direction for us to take, and no way for us to determine excellence according to some objective standard. Pursuing excellence might perhaps then make no sense, but it might still be worth doing. There's a tension here between the individual pursuit of excellence and the sense of collectivity that I evoked above. If we are all creating ourselves without a blueprint, which I think we are, how exactly are we connected with others who are themselves self-shaping, meaning-making creatures? I'm most interested in the question of how an attunement to collectivity can help with making more generous collective decisions about freedom for ourselves and the world. It could induce despair to give up the idea that we humans come into the world with a higher purpose. And I think about this a lot in the current turn toward a particular kind of Instagram mysticism and the love of astrology that is happening, especially among my students. A real wish for the universe to have a message for me personally and a plan and a lesson. Like I see this sense of like, oh, it's hard to feel like no one has a plan for you. Because it means that there's no reason to live other than the reasons we give ourselves. We have only self-generated excellences to pursue. But instead of evoking despair, I find this idea quite beautiful. Given that we have no higher purpose in the sense of destiny or fate, there is no higher purpose than practicing freedom from the middle of what we've been flung into in all its mess. While having no fate but what we make, which is an echo of a refrain in the Terminator movies, having no fate but what we make is existentially demanding. I think it can also be ethically and politically satisfying. Okay, so for the second, or the final third, half third, now I'm just going to talk about Le Guin and how she helps me think about all of that. How is everyone doing right now? Following? Okay, good. So this section is called The Choices of a Social Being Are Never Made Alone. So hold in mind, existentialist thing, we always are free to choose whatever our facticity is, we can choose, and that constitutes the capacity for transcendence. So 2 quotes from Ursula Le Guin's work anchor my thinking about existentialist anarchism, both from the fictional world of her, what was called ambiguous utopia, The Dispossessed. They are first, an anarchist is one who, choosing, takes the responsibility of a choice. So an anarchist is one who, choosing, takes the responsibility of the choice. This offers a pretty straight up existentialist sentiment. Within the scope of choice, we are radically responsible for the choices we make. The second is, but the choices of a social being are never made alone. This offers a particular form of anarchist orientation grounded in the tradition of communist anarchism or anarchist communism. There are 3 parts of this: choosing, accepting the responsibility of a choice, and understanding the social space that shapes what choices we can make. Choosing is already complicated. It is something we do in the real world, which is to say, our choices have limits. I can't choose to levitate or to subsist on sunshine. I remain rooted to the earth and require food and water. I can choose to walk down the street or take a vow of silence, or both at once, which would make the nakedness hard to explain. Either way, there would be social consequences. Those threatened consequences, or the everydayness of clothing, as something that we just put on, might mean that we don't experience putting on clothes every day as a choice at all, but as something we have to do, as surely as we have to touch the earth to move through space. So part of choosing is figuring out whether we have choices. This is more difficult than we might think. The things we feel as imperative or obligations might be materially possible, but socially very difficult. Or we might have internal compulsions that make us feel very strongly that we have to do some things and cannot do others. Or we might face material constrictions that are not like gravity, but that are also not like wearing clothes. If we're imprisoned in migrant detention experiencing grinding poverty, or are ill, many possibilities are foreclosed to us. Choosing requires having a surprising amount of self-understanding and understanding of the world. It's easy to think of choice in very short-term ways. Would you like a cup of tea? What kind? But choosing also has duration. It's a product of the histories we inherit, and it produces the future we'll pass along to the rest of the world. We might say, I can't choose to end capitalism tomorrow. That's like choosing to levitate. We could say, defund the police is a politically naive statement, mere rhetoric. Might as well call yourself a breatharian. Breatharians who believe that you can just live on air alone actually existed, especially in California. And there was one famous one who was discovered not to be a breatharian when he came out of 7-Eleven, which is like a really sort of basic like store that you can just buy little, drinking a really enormous, they have these ice things called slushies that are just ice. And someone took a picture of him, you know, he was just claiming that he lived on air and sun. Had this, you know, like the most disgusting thing you could consume is a 7-Eleven slushie. If you were going to eat anything, you know, anyway, you might as well call yourself a breatharian. When people in the past made the choice to end chattel slavery, that choice too was framed as though it was so naive as to be incoherent or out of touch with reality. Choosing abolition, choosing to abolish slavery, required many shorter-term choices that did not on their own end enslavement. Many enslaved people died, freeing themselves and each other, and we will never know their names. Many freed Black and Indigenous people chose over and over to do the work that freed others and collectively moved the world. Some white people chose against whiteness in an ongoing and unfinished process of becoming abolitionists. Our choices can be long-term, and they can be choices that open up the possibility for things that we cannot yet choose, but that we want others to be able to do. So our choices can open up future choices for others. We each make personal choices, but also as a society, we make collective choices. And I find it hard to see the line between these sometimes. I know that it's impossible for me to end capitalism by simply deciding to buy fewer things or to try not to buy things made by slave labor. My individual lifestyle choices don't have that much weight. But collective choices do have that much weight. Collective movements are the only way big systems have ever been changed. So I can make personal choices to be part of collective choices that make it possible to change big things, to make choices that are currently impossible to make. The second part of this phrase from Le Guin asks what it means to accept the responsibility of choice. The social and material conditions outside of us shape and constrain our choices. In that context, we can still take the responsibility of choice. For people comfortable with fixed hierarchies, it can work really well to place the responsibility of choice on a higher power. People say, I'm doing this because my religious traditions and teachers said this is the way to do things, or I need to do this because my boss is making me. For an anarchist or a non-theist, such a deferral of why we're making the choices we are is an incoherent abdication of responsibility, a negation of politics. Accepting the responsibility of choice means knowing what things are actually choices, which may be a much broader array than we initially think, and then recognizing that it is we who are choosing. Accepting the responsibility of choice means that we don't pretend that so many things are out of our hands. We know what things are choosable, and we acknowledge that we're choosing. There's a social aspect to this. It might be impolite to say to someone that we just don't like them enough to spend time with them. I don't think that taking the responsibility of choice means that we need to be rude. If we're not spending time with someone because we prefer staying home to their company, we can refrain from lying to ourselves about that. I used to think about the existentialist frame about bad faith as basically about betraying our transcendence by defaulting too much to our facticity. Like I can't go out because, my partner won't let me, or I'm too tired. But actually, when I went back and reread Being and Nothingness, which I was amazed, like I'd annotated it when I was 19 all the way through, and I went back and read. It's so long. Sartre, was on really intense speed, basically. And he was writing these incredibly long things constantly. Anyway, Being Nothing is very long. And I was so interested to see that actually, like, the main way he talks about bad faith is that you're trying to lie to yourself. And you kind of know that you're lying to yourself. Because it shifted. And I think about that. Like, what does it mean to not just think about the facticity and transcendence thing, but about that question of the fact that we can't ever self-deceive, but we do try. So accepting the responsibilities means that we don't pretend that so many things are outside of our hands. We know what things are choosable, and we acknowledge that we're choosing. This statement about choice is one of the reasons I started thinking of Le Guin as an existentialist anarchist. I don't know that she would accept this as a designation, either the existentialism or the anarchism. She did say that she'd be touched to be considered an anarchist of a particular stripe, and placed her book, The Dispossessed, in the lineage of Kropotkin and Goodman. She also explicitly explores anarchism, not just in The Dispossessed, but also in this short story, The Day Before the Revolution, focusing on Leah Aseo Odo, who's an aging and dying revolutionary. She's the one who's inspired the world and the events of The Dispossessed. Odo has had a stroke and is irritated, both about being old and less nimble than she was, and also that the young people around her want to canonize her. Some young revolutionaries have come from far away and want to see her, and she's cranky at the thought of being forced to see them, or at being an object to be venerated instead of a living revolutionary to work alongside. She decides to skip the meeting, to go out in the street for a walk, thinking that it's ridiculous to have worked for freedom all her life, and then to have these obligations to be gazed upon like a monument. As she starts off, she thinks to herself this phrase: what is an anarchist? One who, choosing, accepts the responsibility of choice. And instead of leaving and going for a walk, she goes down and talk to the young visitors. So this statement in the context of the story, I think, helps us think about the practice of this choosing and this acceptance. Odo has made a lifetime of choices. She has shaped who she is through those choices into someone who is committed to a revolution based on collectivity and mutual care. When this phrase comes to her mind, it acts as a reminder of that lifetime of choices. She cannot be who she is and act just as an individual following a whim. She's called to accept responsibility, not only for the choice in the moment, to talk with the visitors or skip the meeting, but also for all the choices that made her someone they want to talk to. That longer trajectory of choice calls her into a kind of integrity that matters. She is choosing in that long context of her life, and thus needs to accept the responsibility of all of those choices. But it is only her own choosing that has shaped her in this way, and that too is part of her responsibility. This phrase comes up for me now when I'm resisting doing something that I know I am committed to, or when I want to blame someone else for a hard decision. It's a provocation instead of a directive, asking me to discern what is a choice I can make, and what are responsibilities I can accept. What is gravity and what is movement? I find it helpful. The conundrum at the heart of knowing what is a choice and accepting the responsibility of it also speaks to a core issue in existentialism more broadly, identifying what is facticity and what is unfurling our transcendence. Where might current facticities be shifted, transformed into freedom? How far can we stretch facticity before it becomes indeterminate, a matter of transcendence? People have, after all, over and over again, transformed attempts to make them no more than things, right? So literally, if you're enslaved and you're made into a thing, how do you assert your transcendence, right? They've refused those attempts to transform them to mere facticity into practices of freedom. So then let's go back to this other claim, that the choices of a social being are never made alone. This reference comes from the novel The Dispossessed, at a moment in which the anarchist society on the moon is confronting famine. Shevik, the main character in the novel, is a theoretical physicist. He's not very directly useful in a famine. He returns from a work posting helping grow food to discover that the family he was coming back to has been in turn posted where Takvar, the partner of his life, can use her skills as a biologist to help feed people far away and where there is no need for either his physics skills or his manual labor. The computer that allocates work assignments has many more options for hard labor other places. Shevik yearns to see the child who has been growing up without him, the partner he misses. He yearns to do the physics work that make him come alive. But the choices of a social being are never made alone. And so he takes a posting planting halm seeds and doesn't see that distant family for many years. We could read this as simply the force of social pressure compelling someone to not do what they want to do. And indeed, the question of what compulsions function in an anarchist society is central to the dispossessed. While Le Guin called it an ambiguous utopia, I think it's perhaps better characterized as an exploration of some of the expected failure modes of anarchist communism, reckoning with people who hoard resources, are intellectual or physical parasites on the social polity, victimization by an overcalcification of revolutionary structures into dogma, social approbation constraining individual self-expression, and the ways that having only informal and decentralized structures militates against addressing abuses of power. Anyone who's done any work in any anarchist organization has seen all of the things that happen in the novel The Dispossessed on a smaller scale, or I certainly have. Aside from these issues, which Le Guin definitely meant to address, readers can now perceive other issues: the relentless heterosexism of the novel, the presumption of binary gender, a specific kind of ableism built into even sympathetic characters' responses to mental illness, a kind of whitening of the social polity through imagining that there are no racial differences operating on either the anarchist moon or the propertarian planet it orbits, and a reinstantiation of romantic and sexual monogamy as the most meaningful form of relationship. So it's a complicated book. But it's helping us think about that question of the social being and what choices we make. I think existentialism as a tradition has been most commonly equated with a certain kind of individualism. And most of the times I have found existentialism and anarchism linked have been with references to individualists that I don't personally consider anarchists, like egoist Max Stirner. The efforts of canonical writers like Sartre and Beauvoir to argue for the necessity of collective freedom to our personal choices are compelling, moving, but actually I think they're not convincing. In my own thinking, I've been particularly enticed by Beauvoir's argument that because oppression is something humans do to one another, therefore also freedom is something we open to one another. Sartre famously argues that when we choose for all of humanity. But as philosopher Marjorie Green argued in a 1948 critique of existentialism, while this argument scans in the specific example Sartre gives of individual fighters in the French resistance who carry individually the knowledge that their personal mistakes could result in disaster for others in the resistance, it's harder to transpose to the context of recycling or whether to take a plane flight. And similarly, the actual practice of how we open freedom to others is less obvious to me than the actual practice of how we oppress them. So it's here that I find the usefulness of Le Guin's novelistic evocations of responsibility of choice. And I'm framing this, and I'll just sort of mention this very quickly. I'm in my last paragraph here. So I'm seeing Le Guin as doing this work in hermeneutic justice. So I think hermeneutic justice is one way that we might open freedom to others. This names when others give us the interpretive space or tools to understand something about our experience, especially when preventing that understanding politically or socially stabilizes structures of injustice, of oppression and benefit. We may in fact require helpful interpret of others to not only name but even experience our felt world. So one of the questions that I have as I close is this question of what literature can offer our projects of hermeneutic generosity, of imagining worlds that don't yet exist and helping us imagine choosing them. For me, Le Guin's work on the responsibilities we take up in our choosing offers one example of how building our own meaning against fixed hierarchies is helpful. When and if we offer better interpretive resources to people, I think that allows us to be or become something that was possible in and through the relations we might offer each other and the choices that those relations open. Thank you.